Hello and welcome to Tikehau Sphere, a podcast by Tikehau Capital that welcomes leading experts and thinkers from a wide range of backgrounds to discuss and provide key insight on financial, economic, and business topics. I am a host, Thomas Friedberger, Deputy CEO of Tikehau Capital, and today I am delighted to welcome Adam Posen, American economist and president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics.
Tikehau Sphere, thought-provoking conversations with some of the finest minds in business.
Welcome, Adam. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Thomas. I've been learning a lot from our interactions and mine with Tikehau, so thank you.
Thank you. So, Adam, you are the president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the world-leading independent think tank on economics and globalization. Over your career, you've contributed to research and public policy regarding monetary and fiscal policies in the G20, the challenges of European integration since the adoption of the euro, US-China economic relations, and developing new approaches to financial recovery and stability. In September 2019, by appointment of the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, you served for 3 years as an external member of the Bank of England's rates setting monetary policy committee. You were made an honorary commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II in 2014 for your services to British economic policy, and received the Order of the Rising Sun from the government of Japan in 2021 for your distinguished achievements in advancing US-Japanese economic relations and Japanese economic policy in the global context. So, Adam, how the Federal Reserve in the US looks at inflation, and what does it imply for future action on interest rates, according to you?
Well, thank you for generously reading off the intro. Getting right into the Fed, I think the markets have properly priced now. It took some catching up, but I think now they properly have priced in that the Fed is going to raise rates roughly 275 basis points from where we are now by January, February of 23. And I think hawks, doves, basically everybody agrees this is what you need to do because this is going to get you a little past what we consider neutral interest rates, and that the inflation momentum in the US, particularly in wages, had to be dealt with by Fed action since they didn't take earlier action. The question going forward is when they get to 2023 first quarter, are they going to be in a place where they can pause and see if maybe things have slowed down enough, or are they going to still be behind and have to continue raising until real interest rates are not just higher than neutral, but positive? Which would mean another 300 plus basis points. Some very distinguished economists, including my colleagues Olivier Blanchard and Jason Furman, think that the latter is the case. They're just going to have to keep raising. As of now, the Fed has great consensus on this year's action and little consensus on action beyond this year. I think the Fed staff and a large number of the FOMC believe that they will do this amount of hikes and they may get a soft landing out of it, or a softish landing. What would a softish landing mean? It would mean inflation coming down well below 5 and clearly on a trend towards 3 at that time. And it would mean that you had maybe one negative quarter of growth or a small rise in unemployment, but not an overt recession. And if you consider the fact that according to the latest GDP data, which is probably going to be revised, but we supposedly had contraction in the first quarter of 2022, and nobody felt like it was contraction, that would be a nice outcome. Is the Fed going to be right, or are my colleagues and people who agree with them going to be right? I fear that my colleagues may be right. Basically, to me, it comes down to two key judgments. First, how much you think so-called anchored inflation expectations, the fact that if you look at the five-year forwards or various surveys, long-run, multi-year expectations for inflation don't seem to have risen very much. How much does that pull down inflation once you start tightening interest rates? And second, what do you think of the labor market? How much you think that workers are going to be able to continue staying in the US? Well, heck, inflation last year was 5%, 7%, you have to catch me up, versus, all right, I got my one-time raise, but I can't keep bargaining that way. And if you're in the Blanchard, Furman type camp, you believe that the anchored inflation expectations don't really help you pull things down. You're going to have to actually put people out of work. And only by putting people out of work, you're going to keep wages from going up. And I think there is the Fed staff and a majority, but not a clear majority of the FOMC is hoping the opposite, that the inflation anchoring will help pull it down and that wages are going to tail off, even though employment hasn't risen very much. And I personally am in the odd position for me of being in the middle. Usually I'm at one end or another of a discussion. And in this case, I think the truth lies in the middle. I think they're probably going to have to go in 2023, keep hiking through into second quarter, but they're not going to have to go as far as Blanchard and Furman think. And I think wages will not come down, but the rate of wage growth will come down, because ultimately American workers don't have that much bargaining power. But again, it'll probably take a small rise in unemployment to get that.
So you just talk about wages and purchasing power for the American people. Now, a question on US social inequalities. Do you think it is becoming a serious problem for policymakers and for the structure of the economy in the US?
It's a serious problem because it hurts people, and it hurts the long-run potential of the US, and it hurts the political stability of the US, it being inequality, particularly income inequality. But is it a problem in the sense that in the next year, if the policymakers don't deal with it, something immediately will blow up, or it's the reaction to inequalities the major cause of our problems? No, I don't think that's right at all. I think our problems in the US are primarily political, and they have to do with cleavages in the society along racial lines and along ideological lines. And those result in inequality, but those don't cause inequality. And I think that's an important distinction. So if you look at trade or immigration or tax policy, sometimes people will say, well, if you just, treated the angry white males outside of the cities better, or you didn't free trade, or you didn't have the financial crisis, they wouldn't be acting this way. And the society would be less divided. But I view it the other way around. Because these primarily angry white males are against cosmopolitans and against people who don't look like them, that's why we get the divisions we do. That's why we can't pass a welfare state or progressive taxes. So inequality is very bad, but the driver isn't the economics. It's made worse because it's political in the US, in my view.
Okay. Now, on a more personal note, and in the continuation of this question, what issues worry you most, and what current developments are you most enthusiastic about in the US?
I think the worry is the radicalism of people on the right, to the degree that they are willing to directly challenge rule of law and the government. And I'm, as a number of people have pointed out, we just saw Marie Le Pen, for all her many faults, stand up and accept defeat in the recent French election. There was no question. The votes were counted, and that was that. And we don't have that in the US. And so that is the single biggest thing. The second thing, on a more economic side, that I worry about as a result is, I think we are going to see continued increases in politicization and corruption around investment, that businesses and investors will be making choices much as one used to do in some developing countries or places with autocracies. I mean, we're not there yet, but I think the factors of which political favors you're doing or seem to be doing will play a bigger role in investment in the US than it has been, and that's going to be bad. And then the third thing I worry about, again, I don't think globalization is to blame for inequality, certainly not the specific degree of inequality we have in the US. But I think the anti-globalization sentiment and in particular the fear of China puts us at risk of reacting in ways that are going to be self-harming as well as harmful for the world. I've recently written about this. I had a new piece in Foreign Affairs a few weeks ago titled "The End of Globalization?" I don't choose the titles, but it talked a bit about how this combination of fear of China plus US anti-globalization feeling could have bad effects on the world economy, on the access to development, on the division of the world economy into blocks, Chinese and otherwise. On that side, I think the ability of our labor market to recover from COVID does show some strengths that recent data might have led you to believe weren't there. The people were more adaptable. I wish they hadn't had to go through it, but once they went through it, they were more adaptable. There were businesses founded, there were people who moved, there were jobs taken and grown. And that's heartening because a lot of recent data in the US had suggested that wasn't the case.
Adam, I would like to touch now on the US and energy transition for the last question. What is the attitude of the United States on this topic? And do you think this is different to prevailing views in Europe?
I think, unfortunately, it's very different. I really wish the US would listen to prevailing views from Europe. And at times I've said publicly, I think the European Union should be ready to sort of smack the US upside the head on energy. President Biden's administration tried to do some constructive things on energy. It was included in some of the big bills that were proposed last year, but which never made it through Congress. And explicitly, the reason why two key Democratic senators voted against them was they were too unfavorable to fossil fuels. So I think there's going to come a time when the European Union is going to have to use its things like the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, to try to force the US to behave more responsibly, to increase its price on carbon or some such. And the goal has to be to try to convince the US that it can't just sort of substitute for having a high price for carbon. And so in the US right now, the Biden administration kept saying to their European counterparts, well, we can't put a price on carbon, but we're doing the following combination of subsidies for green tech and various regulations. And here's a complicated computational process for why that's equivalent to an increase in carbon prices. And I don't think, frankly, Europe should accept that. I think they should push back. And if Europe doesn't push back, there's no one else who can push back against the US.
Thank you. So we focused a lot on the US situation in this podcast. Just to finish with, is there anything you would like to add in terms of messages that seem to you important to our auditors with regards to the rest of the world or the US?
I would add two if I could, Thomas. First, I think the Fed is in a very different situation than the European Central Bank, let alone the Bank of Japan or the People's Bank of China. I think that the Fed has, as we discussed, a real chance of doing too little too late. I hope not, but they might. Whereas I do think the ECB stands a risk of doing too much in terms of raising interest rates. I think the inflation really is potentially just a transitory energy shock. And I think the Bank of Japan is quite right to maintain its yield curve control and not talk about raising rates. And the implication of that, which is the second thing I want to raise, is people have begun to notice in markets how much the Japanese yen has depreciated against the dollar in recent weeks. I can't pretend that I saw this coming. I didn't. But I do think that we're looking at, we usually pay too little attention to the yen yuan cross, that the Japanese economy has good reason that their currency should not wander too differently from where the Chinese yuan is, for economic fundamentals as well as politics. And so I could see us over the next couple of years having a situation where we're in a longish strong dollar cycle. So there are some analogies to the 80s of, like Volcker, you're having to do a catch-up significant rate tightening, though nothing like Volcker did. Like Volcker era, you're dealing with some fiscal excess. And at the same time, the major other trading economies are not in position to have that kind of monetary tightening. And that's the recipe we got for a very strong dollar in the mid-80s against all comers. And I think it's increasingly likely we're going to see something like that for the next couple of years.
Understood. Adam, thank you very much for joining us today for what has been a thought-provoking conversation. Thank you for turning into this episode of Tikehau Sphere, a podcast by Tikehau Capital that welcomes leading experts and thinkers from a wide range of backgrounds to discuss and provide key insight on financial, economic, and business topics. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.